Good evening, welcome. My name is Nicola Longford. I'm Executive Director here at the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza. And this is a really special evening here. We're to honor and welcome back to Dallas tonight's special guest, Mr. Sid Davis. And Sid will take us on a remarkable flight with multiple stops as he provides highlights from his long, illustrious career. And tonight we'll specifically cover the period where he served as White House Correspondent for Westinghouse Broadcasting Corporation. Sid had privileged access to the inner sanctum of the Oval Office, and his keen reporting as eyewitness to President Kennedy's critical decision-making and influence from one crisis to the next will no doubt provide interesting contrast to parallel issues today. This evening's conversation will be led by curator Stephen Fagan. Stephen has been with the museum for 17 years, oversees the museum's oral history project, and is a key member of the museum's collections, curatorial, and interpretive team. Stephen is a highly skilled interviewer and will engage our special guest like no other. The design of these museum programs is to construct tangible bridges from the past to the present and to form new pathways for future learning. These programs help shape and broaden the depth of our collective understanding and appreciation of historical events that took place within living memory for many of you here, but not all of you. In fact, for those of you that can remember this exact time 55 years ago, in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a terrifying 13-day period of intense suspense infused with deft political and secret negotiations that very nearly drew the United States and the Soviet Union into a nuclear war. Barely a year later, President John F. Kennedy lost his life here in Dallas, and another sort of crisis was placed on the nation. Sid Davis was here to document and record both, and is here now to share his experience from a unique vantage point these 5 decades later. Before turning the stage over to Stephen and Sid, I would like to thank fearless leader Victor Elmore, who is the museum's board chair over here, for his long support of the museum and for all his guidance and support. And I'd also like to thank the incredible team here, the staff, every one of them across the entire institution, as it really takes everyone to bring such a program as this one to life. And lastly, Sid, I'm most grateful to you for agreeing to travel from the East Coast back to the museum for this memorable event, and by helping the Sixth Floor Museum fulfill our mission to collect, record, and make accessible these important and historic experiences, your memories and perspectives for future generations. And so, Stephen, take it over.
Thank you very much for being here tonight. It's always a pleasure when we're able to talk to a participant, someone that lived the experience of the 1960s. And you're in for a real treat tonight because we're going to cover quite a lot of ground in a very short span of time. So I want to go ahead and get started. Sid, you were the White House Correspondent for Westinghouse Broadcasting. Take us back and tell us a little bit about Westinghouse in the early 1960s.
Well, first of all, Westinghouse Broadcasting Company was the first company in the United States to own a radio station. It was KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the first radio station in America that was commercial, and it broadcast the Harding-Cox elections and became a forerunner in television when television came into being. I joined the company in 1959, September of 1959. I'd been a news director and a reporter in Youngstown, Ohio, which is my hometown. We used to have an expression in Youngstown, which was a coal and steel town, that I came clean from Youngstown, which was impossible. In any case, after 7 years in Youngstown, I decided it was time to go to Washington. I always wanted to go to Washington. And I joined up with the Westinghouse Broadcasting Company, and I had a wonderful boss. I'll try to be brief because there's so little time, at least for me. But my first assignment, I was told, I was going to cover the United States tour of Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union. Now, I was coming out of reporting in a town that had the mafia and pimps and whores and city council and so on. So I was moving to the big leagues here, and I was going to be surrounded by some of the titans of American journalism who were on this trip. But I I got married in the interim, and my wife, Barbara, you see my wife's picture on the Air Force One. I'll explain that in a second. But she did a lot of research on Khrushchev for me and communism, and that helped me along. So that was my first assignment, was going on the road coast to coast with Nikita Khrushchev for about 14 days, and that was an experience in itself. Let me explain the Air Force One picture, if I can, momentarily. That's my little son, Larry, who's here in the front row. Stand up, Larry, please. That's Dr. Larry Davis, and his brother is Dr. Morse Davis. We have two of them in the family. In any case, the reason that picture is taken is because we flew Air Force One on many occasions, and we would fly it only on trips to Texas when the president wanted to stay at the ranch for a period that was longer than a day or two. He would go for a month at Christmas, and sometimes in the summertime we'd go for a month. And usually it was a White House Correspondent. There were about 40, what we call 40 regulars who covered the White House. We went everywhere the president went, and today there are about 200 of them, but they don't travel the way we did. Some do travel, some don't. And we went on trips with Johnson everywhere. And Johnson, who read the papers notoriously, watched television notoriously. He had 3 television sets in every room of his house, and the Oval Office had 3 television sets. Watched television a lot, and he decided that the stories about him were better when our spouses were along. And so he made a deal. This is typical LBJ. He made a deal with Pan American World Airways, the company that flew the press plane, that if we brought our families, it would be $25 if you had 1 child. If you had 2 or 10, the charge was $55 round trip on Pan Am World Airways Boeing 707s. And the hotel, Johnson got the Hotel Driscoll in Austin to give us a price on the hotel room. And our companies paid for all of that. So it was a real delight. My son Larry got to know President Johnson and Mrs. Johnson coming down there. He was very good with children. And that's the reason you see Larry in that picture with Barbara. Barbara passed away a couple of years ago. But we had a wonderful time covering the White House. Getting back to what he wanted to talk about.
Well, we all want to hear your stories, but let's go back, because we're looking at a picture here of Kennedy and Nixon, the 1960 presidential campaign, and then this other picture is you with President Kennedy the night before that inauguration, right. January 19th. Tell us, you spent 8 weeks with Kennedy and 8 weeks with Nixon. Tell us a little bit about the differences you noticed between these men.
I've always maintained, in talking about the 60 campaign, that throughout, I think the Nixon-Kennedy campaign had the 2 most evenly matched candidates in history, really. They were both Navy veterans. They both were in the Senate for 14 years and in the House. And in temperament, they were quite different. They were opposites in temperament. There's no question about it. Nixon was, I wouldn't say he was a dark figure, but he was more of a gut fighter. He was a real politician, and he could get into the gutter if he had to. Kennedy was more aloof, even though he was just as tough. You know, Kennedy had an expression that, forgive your enemies, but never forget their names. And that's a typical Kennedy family motto. But in campaigning, I thought they were both, in intelligence, they're both the same. But in temperament, quite the opposite. Nixon was more fisticuffs than John Kennedy. John Kennedy did things in a more placid way. In campaigning with him, Nixon angered much faster than Kennedy did if he were in a situation where it was uncomfortable. Kennedy was more gracious. Kennedy knew to flash a smile. He always had a nicer comment about people if there was a confrontation of any kind in debates, etc. The 60 campaign was a remarkable campaign, too. It's a classic television presidential campaign. The debates really were remarkable. They're sort of here to stay. They have not abandoned them yet. They've changed them somewhat. The League of Women Voters used to run it. I thought they were better when the League ran them than others, but the networks took it over, and the politicians got somewhat involved. The 60 debate, there were 4 debates. I went to all 4. I went to the first one was in Chicago. And I'll just one little short story about it. Nixon was suffering from a staph infection in one of his knees. He just felt rotten. He felt lousy. The medication wasn't working that well. He didn't look well. And the night of the debate, when the makeup people came around to put makeup on people, Nixon, being this tough street kid, said, "I don't want any makeup. I don't like makeup. You know, I don't want any makeup." Sissies wear makeup. He didn't say that, but I knew what he was saying. I don't want to put makeup on me. He had a terrible complexion, and his problem with his beard was even worse. He shaved 2 or 3 times a day, I'm told. His beard just kept growing on him. So he always had a 5 o'clock shadow. Kennedy was wealthy enough to have rested up nicely and was at his father's mansion down in Palm Beach, Florida, lying in the sun, getting a nice tan. He looked the picture of health when he walked into the studio. There was only a couple of minutes left before airtime when they walked in and shook hands. You see it in the picture. And Nixon had been told by his staff, "Get makeup. You'd really need makeup." At this point, Nixon turns and he sees Kennedy. And he said, he said, "I'll take the makeup." Well, they only had about 5 minutes left here. So the makeup person went home. So they sent someone, staff member, down to the local CBS in Chicago, and they got a package of Max Factor pancake. I think it was Pan Stick, I think it was called. And they brought that in. Well, that wasn't television makeup, and that was not good makeup. And they slathered this all over his face, and he looked worse than he did before. He looked better when he was sick than he did when they put the makeup on. So he's at a disadvantage in appearance right off the bat, and he wasn't feeling well. And the debate went on, and there are stories that say that people who saw the debate on television thought Kennedy won, and the people who heard it on radio thought Nixon had won. I thought it was pretty much close to a tie. Kennedy was a little more gracious, his language a little better. Nixon had a tendency to become angry if he thought he was being attacked, and that showed. His performance was bad. The other problem Nixon had was he perspired more than anybody else I've ever known. I mean, he had a gusher coming out of him. And no one ever taught him how to, if you're a performer, there's a certain way you perform. If you're perspiring, and movie stars know it all the time, if you're supposed to perspire as part of the act, for instance, you take your hanky out of your pocket and you dab it gently. Nixon was perspiring, he takes out his hanky and his gestures were just so on television that counted against him too. The appearance of Nixon on television just didn't help him a lot.
Let's use that as a good segue, because Kennedy has often been called the first television president.
Correct.
And you attended so many of those televised debates, and the reporters who had covered Eisenhower's debates acted a little differently on the Kennedy in the Kennedy debates. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, most of the newspaper people resented the television. They didn't like us because they saw television creeping into their domain. They were the authorities in journalism. They were the ones who were the New York Times, Washington Post, New York Herald Tribune, LA Times. They were the premier people in journalism, and now we were encroaching on their territory. And Kennedy decided that he would be the first president to have regularly scheduled television news conferences. Eisenhower had one television news conference, but Kennedy made it about an every 2 or 3 week affair. And he was good at it, too. He looked good. He always had something interesting or humorous to say. And the reporters started realizing that the crowds, the audiences now, were not all newspaper readers. They were younger people. They were watching television. And they saw that what television did to people. A friend of mine was Peter Lissagor. Some of the older people in the room here might not remember Peter Lissagor of Chicago Daily News. I helped Peter get into television. He did some television. And Peter said that in talking about what the differences were, he'd been around a long time. And Peter said, I could walk down K Street in Washington for 3 hours and maybe one person would come up to me and say, Mr. Lissager, I read your column. I go on television for 6 months, and I go down K Street, and 100 people will stop me in the first block and say, I saw you on television last night. That was the difference between the two. Television really was taken over. The newspaper people recognized it, and more the newspaper guys who were a little more bedraggled than we were. They didn't care about what their clothes looked like or wearing a nice shirt or whatever. They started going to the barber shop before they got to the news conference. And they didn't get permanent waves, but they got a haircut. They started buying better shoes, better clothes because they caught the television bug. The Kennedy news conferences were absolutely one of the most interesting you ever attend because of the way he handled the crowd. He always had a pretty good line if he had to. At Ted Sorensen, one of his chief aides, who wrote beautifully and had a great sense of humor. He had Pierre Salinger as his press secretary, who was a perfect television press secretary. And Kennedy also called on women a lot in the audiences. One of the women, some of you people that are closer to my age would remember May Craig of a Maine newspaper. She was a little 80-year-old grandmother, and she wore a pink pillbox straw hat. And she'd get up and point her finger at the president and lecture him. And they couldn't have hired somebody out of central casting to be more perfect for the role because Kennedy would treat her so gently. And he would go along with if she yelled at him, and she would criticize him quite a lot. For instance, she raised a question at one of the news conferences, you have not done enough about women. And he said, and he shuffled his foot, and he gave you the Herb Schreiner look, He said, I think you're right. I think we can do better. And so the audience, it became a part of the show to have Nate Craig in the picture. And they would select people in the audience. They knew the reporters that were good television people, good props for the president, so that they would tell Kennedy we're so-and-so. He always knew where May was because she wore the straw hat. But for news reporters, he would pick certain reporters because they were good television. So he was really a dramatic director of his television shows. And they became a habit in America. He held, I think, something like 60 news conferences in the short time he was there because he would use television a lot because he was good at it. Nixon was not as good on television.
Here we have on the screen two events, Bay of Pigs, April 1961, Cuban Missile Crisis, October 62. One, a tremendous failure. The other, perhaps the most successful and important moment of the Kennedy presidency. You covered both. Let's talk a little bit about that. I think it's good to reflect on Bay of Pigs while we talk about Cuban missiles. So you were following Kennedy. He was doing some congressional campaigning.
Yeah.
And pick up the story
That's a missile crisis. Bay of Pigs was a little
right.
different.
We'll talk about Bay of Pigs in retrospect.
We were campaigning in Cleveland, Ohio, and Springfield, Illinois. The plan was Cleveland, Springfield, overnight in Chicago. The next night in Chicago, he was going to make a speech to a Democratic Party gathering, and then he was going to fly to Seattle to close the World's Fair. If you recall, the World's Fair was taking place in 1962. I think it was closing that year. The speech in Springfield was an ordinary political speech, not much to it. We flew into Chicago to overnight and went to bed. And just before dawn, we got a phone call. There were about 30 or 40 of us on this trip. That was a normal complement of White House correspondents. And said that get down to the press room as soon as you can. We need you down there very immediately. So I grabbed a shirt, left my pajama bottoms on. I don't know what else I got. I got enough to cover me so wouldn't be arrested for something. I ran for the elevator and I dressed myself on the way down to the press room, wondering what in the hell it could have been that was so important to wake us up in the middle of the night. Pierre Salinger addressed a small gathering and said, the president is suffering from an upper respiratory problem. He's got a very bad cold, and we're going back to Washington. So go pack your bags and get to O'Hare Airport. The press bus will take you to O'Hare Airport. And so we got to O'Hare Airport, took off. Just a piece of inside baseball here. the press plane always takes off after Air Force One takes off. Air Force One goes first, we follow. Tells you something of our business. When you're landing, we land first and Air Force One lands second. You know why? Photographs of the airplane taking off and landing in the event that Air Force One crashes on takeoff or landing. So it's rather a ghoulish job as well. In any case, we landed ahead of Kennedy at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, and he was wearing a fedora. Now, Kennedy never wore a hat. He hated hats. The only hat he wore as president was the top hat at his inaugural. One of the older correspondents, Warren Rogers of the Herald Trib, said there's something screwy going on here. He doesn't wear a hat. He doesn't look sick. And we started to reminisce about the night before. His speech was terrific. He gave a nice speech. He was in good shape. We decided he was not sick, that we're being lied to. So instead of going home for the weekend when we landed back in Washington, a lot of us stayed around the White House thinking something was funny here. And by late afternoon, the black limousines carrying the cabinet members and the secretaries of several departments and some military people started coming to the White House, and then we knew we really had something. Next question was, what is it? And the thinking was primarily Berlin. Something the Russians are pushing us again. Khrushchev didn't want us in Berlin. We had West Berlin, they had East Berlin. One of the reasons was that West Berlin was doing so much better economically and in every sense. East Berlin was a captive city, and that was a sore spot for Khrushchev. There were other political reasons for it, but he wanted us out of Berlin, and he was always testing us in Berlin. So we thought that was the flashpoint of World War III would be Berlin. So we focused on Berlin. Along about Sunday, we started hearing reports that the missiles we suspected were in Cuba were indeed there. What happened was that Friday night that we landed in Chicago, the U-2 films were developed at this point, and Kennedy was notified that night that we confirmed there were not only Soviet missiles in Cuba, Soviet MiG-21s, and 23,000 Soviet troops, combat-ready troops in Cuba. A reprisal probably by Khrushchev against the fact that we sent some Cuban exiles in to throw Castro out the year before. That might have been one of Khrushchev's reasons. I never saw it as a major reason, but I think we did. And then at that point, we realized we were in a crisis mode. Kennedy was meeting several times a day. Kennedy's brilliance in these matters really showed in this crisis area. The National Security Council in full membership is about 100 people or more. I mean, a lot of people are in the National Security Council. Kennedy decided right off the bat that he was going to call it the XCOM, and we reduced the numbers. He wanted a more manageable group to manage. So he reduced it somewhere, I think there were about 30 or 40, maybe even less than that, so he could handle everybody and wouldn't have a mob scene when he wanted to make any decisions. And they started meeting. They called it the XCOM, and they started meeting. When we heard that he was deciding to have a smaller group and calling it the XCOM, then we knew we were really in trouble. And that weekend, the president, I learned a lot of this later, I learned from Clint Hill, Mrs. Kennedy's Secret Service agent, that Kennedy had called Mrs. Kennedy. She was on vacation at Glenora, their place in Middleburg, Virginia, and called Mrs. Kennedy and said he wanted her to come back to Washington. And he told Clint Hill, I want you to get a helicopter this time. And Clint told me later that she never used a helicopter from Glenora to Washington. She always came by limo. So when she landed on the White House lawn, that was another clue that something was happening. They pulled her back from Glenora. The weekend progressed pretty well, but the story started leaking out that it might not be Berlin, that it might be someplace else. And by Sunday, we were pretty much convinced it was Cuba. Nobody told us anything, and they announced that President Kennedy would have a nationwide address to the nation at 7 p.m. on Monday night, the 22nd of October, which is the anniversary of that was yesterday. And so
let's do the Eisenhower call. We have you wanted to play a brief segment of a conversation, a private conversation between President Kennedy and former President Eisenhower.
Let me lead into it with something right before that. Kennedy, the year before the Cuban Missile Crisis, had ordered or agreed to an invasion of Cuba by a ragtag bunch of Cuban exiles who were supposed to overthrow Castro. We provided some flimsy airplanes, old military airplanes. We didn't give them much air cover. It was a poorly organized operation. It was conceived by the CIA during the Eisenhower years, before Kennedy took over. 8 weeks after Kennedy became president, the CIA came to him and said, we've got this plan, get rid of Castro. We get down there with the Cuban exiles, and they'll come out of the apartment buildings and their huts and their houses, and they will go into the streets and overthrow the government, and Castro will be out. And Kennedy bought it. It was a disaster. And so he called Eisenhower afterwards. He was getting all kinds of bad press. Kennedy wanted to have a little company in this thing because Eisenhower had approved this plan before he left office. He never ordered it, but he did. Very clever politician. Mr. Kennedy says, I got to have my picture taken with Eisenhower. He's partly to blame for this. I'm sure this is my thinking, you know. I got to get close to this. Eisenhower is a very popular figure. So he invites Eisenhower up to Camp David for a talk. And I have a transcript of the conversation that they had up there. Eisenhower knew he was being used. He didn't like the ideas brought up there. He carried a fedora with him, and he didn't wear it, but he carried that fedora behind him with both hands, and he was holding fedora with both hands behind his back, and they only let us take pictures from outside the gate. We couldn't go inside. So we walked around to where we could see. They walked around the beautiful, Camp David's a very beautiful, rustic place. And you could see Eisenhower talking to him, but never took his hands off his hat behind him. Then they went inside the Aspen Lodge, which is the presidential lodge up there, and Eisenhower and Kennedy had a discussion. And the transcript shows Eisenhower says at one point, I won't go through all this because we don't have that much time, but Eisenhower said, now, Mr. President, did you talk about air cover for these people you're sending down there to risk their lives? And Kennedy said, no, I personally didn't. Did you talk about some of this or that? And Kennedy said, no. He said, I just assumed all of this. Eisenhower said, you never assume. He really lectured him. He tore into him in this private meeting. Now it's a year later, and the missile crisis is blossoming. And now we're into the Saturday weekend just before the speech.
Yeah. So here's a little clip of that phone call 55 years ago yesterday. The sound quality's pretty bad, but it's a phone call from 1962.
My idea is this. The damn Soviets will do whatever they want, what they figure is good for them.
Yeah.
And I don't believe they relate one situation with another. That's what they find out they can do here and there and the other place.
Yeah. And what's your judgment as to the chances they'll fire these things off if we invade Cuba?
I don't believe a bit.
You don't think they will?
Right. Something may make these people shoot them off. I just don't believe this will.
Yeah, all right.
In any event, of course, I'll say this. I'd want to keep my own people very alert.
Yeah. No, hang on tight.
Yes, sir.
Thanks a lot, General.
All right, thanks.
All right.
Now, the question was, what do you think Khrushchev's going to do? What Kennedy did in the first instance in this conversation was to tell Eisenhower what his plans were for this Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, this is a year after he got chewed out. And Eisenhower's he's a little cold to start because the last time they saw each other, Eisenhower was a little upset that he got hauled to Camp David. And let me take one step here and tell you a little bit about Eisenhower. When the session ended up at Camp David, after Eisenhower really read the riot act to Kennedy, they gave us a 5-minute period to talk to Eisenhower afterwards. And being journalists and being as nasty as we could be, we tried to get Eisenhower to dump all over Kennedy, to say nasty things about the stupid Cuban
Bay of Pigs.
Invasion. And Eisenhower said, I don't play that game, fellas. I do not criticize the man I replaced. End of news conference. I just thought you ought to know that. Now he's on the telephone with him, and he's driving to New York, and Kennedy asked him whether Khrushchev is going to invade, really. And he said, I don't think so. But then, as Eisenhower talked, he warms up to this guy, and they become very warm on the telephone with each other. There's a lot more to the conversation. Eisenhower is pretty good. He called me, told me what he's going to do, and I shared, and he asked me what I would do and that sort of thing. And Kennedy's last words were, thank you, General, I'm going to hang in there. And that was the first time a president ever said, I'm going to hang in there. But anyway, they ended up on, I mean, it was to me, it was just a very moving experience to see these two guys back on the same wavelength, that they were talking to each other again.
And then later that same night, again, October 22nd, this is the scene in the Oval Office, and you're there. You're not in this picture. We can't see you, but you're in that room when he makes this famous televised address. We're going to listen to a little clip of that, and then I'd like you to talk a little bit about being in the room when this happened.
This clip, incidentally.
Third.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
This clip, listen very carefully to this thing. This is the first time a president of the United States ever got to this point on the crisis. It's the key point of the 17-minute speech that if you had any perception of world politics and foreign affairs, you realize that we were in deep doo-doo at this point.
All right.
Third, it shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
All right.
Could
very
you hear
strong
that?
words. Yeah, very strong words. They can hear it out in the gallery.
Better?
Yeah.
I was going to repeat it. Okay. That was the third point. It shall be the policy of this nation. This is very important. That was the third item in the speech. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. He wasn't going to bomb Cuba like our military people wanted him to do, or invade Cuba. The B-52s were already in the air while Kennedy was making this speech that afternoon at 2 o'clock. Curtis LeMay, the chief of staff of the Air Force, gave a briefing to the staff, the ExComm meeting, that 1/8 of the B-52 bomber fleet was already in the air, going to a staging area to be prepared to drop nuclear bombs on the Soviet Union. Now, of course, you didn't know that. We didn't know that. We didn't know that for years later, that we had come with that far apart before we had nuclear war. Kennedy at one time says in these meetings that we were very close to nuclear war at the time when he talked to the briefing. I thought that key paragraph is it's bone-chilling to see it.
This is obviously very relevant today, here in 2017.
Correct. And you're right there right now to some extent with North Korea.
Well, what lessons can we learn? What can we learn from the Cuban Missile Crisis that we can apply to today?
Well, the first thing I think about, having seen the past 2 months and the back and forth between the White House and Pyongyang, and the acrimony between our president and Jong Kim-un, is that I hope that President Trump reads the transcripts, the Kennedy tapes book, about what happened on the Cuban Missile Crisis. It would be very instructive for him to do that. Kennedy never lost his temper, although Khrushchev was a demon and we didn't like him. Kennedy stayed on a very civil level with Khrushchev, and anything he said, Mr. Chairman, he was respectful and everything. There was no name calling. He didn't call him Big Rocket Man or Big Missile Man or whatever. There were none of that. I mean, the sophistication between the two is so remarkable. And I have to tell you that, to me, it's frightening to some extent. If you're already in a belligerent situation, why make it worse with language? You don't need to do that. That's why you have diplomats. So I think that the lesson is you have a president today that is not a military person. He's not a government official. He's never been in government. He's always run the show the way he wanted it run. And you find out that as president, you can't run the show the way you want to run everything. There's a whole country out there that is responsible to some extent for helping you govern through the Congress. And so I think that we're in this is a tricky situation. And I have to tell you that I'm very pleased with the fact that you have General Kelly, General Mattis, and General Masterson helping to run the show right now. My concern is that don't make any of them angry. Don't let them quit. You've had a revolving door, and you can't do that. You've got the best that there is in our military, and you need them desperately. So I think doing a lot of reading about history would be very good. Now, with Kennedy, Kennedy was a historical figure. He read a lot of history. He knew the nuances of diplomacy, and it showed. Everything showed in this treatment. The missile crisis is I think, a textbook representative of how a crisis has to be handled. No shots were fired. We lost one person. We lost a U-2 pilot flying over Cuba before the whole crisis emerged. One other thing about how close we came to war. How many of you are old? I'm not going to ask your ages, but how many are old enough to have been around during the Cuban Missile Crisis? And most of you are probably 2 or 3 years old, right? Something around. Well, let me just tell you how close we were. There was a plan to evacuate the White House. George Herman of CBS News was chosen as the reporter who would go with President Kennedy to several mountains have been carved out and are safety zones to protect our presidents. And Mount Snow in Virginia was a site that they selected as the #1 site to go to if they had to evacuate. And my friend George Herman had to bring a bag every day that we came to work in case they were going to evacuate that day. If it looked like we were going to war, George would have to go with the president. There were orders by the Secret Service to shoot anybody who tried to get on a helicopter if they were not authorized to do so. The helicopters were based at Anacostia Air Base, which is a 3-minute flight from the White House lawn. The helicopters were not put on the White House lawn because they thought that would further frighten the American people to see evacuation helicopters there. American people were not told about the evacuation plan. And so the helicopters were kept out of sight until if they were needed. Mrs. Kennedy was brought back from Middleburg by helicopter to be at the White House in case anything happened that weekend. My friend Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent, who was Mrs. Kennedy's agent, told me that he arranged for Mrs. Kennedy to have a tour of the White House bomb shelter so she would know, and this was some months before the Cuban Missile Crisis, that she would know what she'd have to do with the children if war came. And the family would either go to the bomb shelter or evacuate. In this case, they were not going to use the bomb shelter. They were going to evacuate. Mrs. Kennedy told Clint Hill, prior to this crisis reaching its highest moment, when he told her they might have to evacuate, she said, "Mr. Hill, if it comes to that, I will take John and Caroline by the hands," and she said, "we will walk to the South Lawn and we will face the danger like the rest of the American people." So it never came to that, but that was her attitude. She was not going to be evacuated. And they had plans to take all these people to get them out of the White House. But I'm just I tell you these stories to tell you how close we really came to nuclear war. And it was averted just by common sense and the fact that we were stronger. Khrushchev knew that. And Khrushchev caved. The deal that was made was that Khrushchev would remove the missiles from Cuba. And Khrushchev asked Kennedy, as a ploy or as a just so he didn't lose face entirely, he demanded that the United States remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. That's what one of the fish bones in his throat, as he once said, was the missiles our missiles in Turkey. Kennedy said he would do it, but he didn't really want the public to know he gave in on anything, so the deal was he will do it, but don't announce it today. Let's wait a while to announce it. He didn't want that announcement made at the same time that Khrushchev caved in. The interesting thing about the deal was that the Jupiter missiles that were in Turkey were leaking fuel, they were rusting, they were worthless, and we had already started replacing them with intercontinental Minutemen missiles. The Jupiters were medium range. These were much better. We were putting stronger, bigger missiles in, so a week or two later, it was revealed privately that Kennedy gave them the Jupiter missiles. I bring that out because that's diplomacy. That's what you do. You don't throw rocks at each other, call each other names. There's a lot more to something than a crisis of this kind.
We're going to need to move on a year in our timeline to Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. We all know what happened that day. Sid, you were there. In fact, here we have the arrival at Love Field. Why don't we start there? So you were there when the Kennedys arrived. You had been a little concerned about Dallas being the most conservative city on the Texas trip. Were you surprised by the enthusiastic response?
Yes, I was to some extent. Yeah, there was some trepidation in the press corps because there have been a couple of events in Dallas that occurred within the weeks or months before the trip was announced for Kennedy. The Kennedy trip to Texas was to mend the political fences in the Democratic Party. You guys in Texas are always fighting with each other, and you don't act like your relatives even. And so there's this plan now where if Kennedy comes down there and you have a big powwow at the LBJ Ranch on Saturday the 23rd of November, and you'll bring them all back together, so in 64 and then in the next campaigns coming up, you're going to win the election. So the idea was to bring the Democratic conservatives and liberals back together. You had Ralph Yarborough on the liberal side, you had John Connally on the other side, and they barely talked to each other, so Kennedy was going to go down there and play the role of a good Samaritan and try to bring them together. But we did have concerns about Dallas. I don't think they were big concerns, but we knew that Adlai Stevenson, our UN ambassador, had been to Dallas, and you had a congressman here, Bruce Alger, who was violently against Kennedy, felt that Kennedy was too soft on communism. And apparently when Lyndon Johnson and Mrs. Johnson were in Dallas, there was a big roughing up at one of the hotels where some reports were that Mrs. Johnson was spat on. I don't know if that's true or not. The other one was that Adlai Stevenson, the UN ambassador, was in town, and there was a demonstration around him, and somebody hit him on the head with a placard, probably not intentionally. And they had a little cut there that they magnified so it got bigger and bigger so that it would look bad, I'm sure. In any case, with that atmosphere, the press corps said, "Is Dallas, what kind of a reception would Kennedy get?" The Cold War was in full bloom, and the question, and a lot of conservatives here felt that Kennedy was not handling it right. The crowds, however, when they landed at Love Field, you see Jackie getting off the plane, the president's behind her. I would say there were 4,000 or 5,000 people there at the airport that came out all the way out there, and they lined the streets beginning at Love Field. The crowds were pretty good. I was on press bus number 1. Press bus number 1 was 8 car lengths behind the presidential limousine and the motorcade. 8 car lengths is about 80 feet. So we could see the car. We could see the President and Mrs. Kennedy sitting in the car. This limousine is a Lincoln Continental. It's not a specially made one. It was off the shelf, I was told later. We always thought that it was bulletproof, but it wasn't. Kennedy told the Secret Service agents the week before that he said, "I'm going to Dallas. We're hoping to get a big turnout. I don't want you guys running alongside the car. I want the crowds to see Jackie. She's important to this campaign." He made a big deal about how the country really loved Jackie, and he didn't want any agents surrounding the car. And this was told the Secret Service 1 week before. So when we got to Dallas and went from Love Field into town, a lot of us were amazed to see how big the crowds were. And we got down around Elm and Houston streets. It was 3 or 4 feet deep of people lining the area. And everybody was cheering. It was a big welcoming thing. The only untoward thing that I saw in this whole arrival from Dallas was a Piper Cub was flying above the motorcade just off to the side, carrying a banner that said, "Coexistence is surrender." And this was the conservatives' argument against Kennedy for being too close to the Soviet Union. Other than that, it was a beautiful day. The weather was balmy. It was about 71 or 73, something in there. Mrs. Kennedy seemed to be, for the first time in a while, she seemed to be enjoying herself. 3 months earlier, she lost the third child. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy died of hyaline membrane disease. And that was a setback for her. This was the first trip for Mrs. Kennedy outside the White House following the death of this little child. So it was a big day for her. And in Fort Worth and Houston the day before, she was just as, she seemed to be happier. She loved the crowds. She loved to be among the people. And the breakfast in Fort Worth, she's always late for breakfast on the road. And Kennedy remarked that takes Jackie a little longer to get here, but you will love it. You'll appreciate her more when she does get here. He said, no one ever worries about what Lyndon and I wear, but they always want to know what Jackie's wearing. And so it was a wonderful reception in Fort Worth. My bottom line is that I think the assassination could have taken place in any American city. I don't think it was not preventable. You can't prevent something like that. There's no way you have enough agents to put them in every office building and every window along a motorcade route.
We're going to take a look. You wanted to show the Zapruder film, so we're going to take a look at that. You've all seen it before. It never gets less disturbing. So just keep that in mind. We are going to show the entire film here. Sid, you were 8 cars back, as you said. Walk us through this. You heard 3 shots fired.
That's right. I was on press bus number 1. As we rounded Houston and Elm, we heard 3 loud reports. Some of the people on the bus thought they were motorcycles. The motorcycle cops, motorcycles were backfiring. When you slow a motorcycle down, as you know, they start to backfire. And we were moving very slowly, probably at 3 or 4 miles an hour. So the sound of the thing was very clear to us. Bob Pierpoint of CBS News was sitting next to me on press bus number 1. He jumped out of his seat and he said, "Fellas, that's gunfire. That's not the motorcycles. It's gunfire. Just look up ahead." So we looked up ahead and we saw the presidential limousine jump out of the motorcade. It just took off to the right. And it was heading to Parkland Memorial. The Secret Service always knows where the nearest hospital is and how to get there. So they took off. We kept yelling at the bus driver to catch up with the presidential limousine, which is a joke. That bus is never going to travel as fast as the presidential limousine is. So we didn't know where they took the president. So the only thing we knew to do, what the bus driver knew to do, was to take us to the Trade Mart. And there were about 2,500 people in the Trade Mart having lunch, waiting for the president to speak. And here comes the press corps like a herd of elephants running through the building, carrying our typewriters, asking where the telephones are for the press room. It was up on the 2nd floor. And people would say, "What's going on? Where's the president?" And we said, "We don't know where the president is." I got on the phone. I called my office and reported the gunfire. And my boss was a fellow named Jim Snyder, wonderful friend and bureau chief. He said, "Sid, it's on the wire. Merriman Smith has filed from the motorcade that shots were fired into the motorcade. The president may have been hit." So I didn't know anything about the president's condition. I then left the Trade Mart, got outside. I waved down a car. A gentleman in a white Cadillac took me to the hospital. He said, "Are you a reporter?" I said, "Yes, I'll get you to the hospital." He took me to Parkland Memorial Hospital. I got there just as the Secret Service were scrubbing the back seat of the limousine. The president was not in the limousine. Jackie was gone too. I got there about 1 or 2 minutes after they had arrived. The Secret Service immediately tried to clean up the car so that no one would see the blood and some of the pieces of brain matter that were in it. And Hugh Sidey, a friend of mine for Time magazine, went over to Hugh and said, tell us what's the latest, Hugh? And Hugh said, he's dead, just like that. And all hell broke loose. We tried to get inside the hospital. They let us go to the second floor. I commandeered a telephone, called my office, and I didn't put that on the air because it was not official. So
You actually heard a priest say that?
I did. I called my office, and they were waiting for word on the president's condition. They didn't know his condition. They just knew he was there. And they asked me to do a report on what I knew up to that point. And all I said was, shots were fired into the motorcade. We don't know the president's condition. We're waiting to find out. Two of my reporter friends were about 20 feet from me, and they waved at me. They saw me on the phone, and they waved at me to come down to where they were. I went down there, and the priest, his name was Father Oscar Huber, and his parish is in the church zone. And I got there just as I heard him say, he's dead all right. I just gave him the last rites. And he said, I told Mrs. Kennedy that I believed his soul had not yet left his body. Now, if you're Catholic, that has a lot of meaning, and it was important for Father Huber to tell us that. I ran back immediately to this wonderful nurse was holding this telephone for me. I never got her name. I just feel so terrible. I never was able to thank her. And I got back on the phone, and I said to my boss, Jim, take me off the air. And he said, why? I said, take me off the air. So they cut me off the air. And I said, Jim, there's a priest here that says the president's dead. What do you want to do? He said, what do you want to do? And I said, I don't think we ought to use it. He's the president. Jim, it's different. And he said, I agree. He was my boss. And so I didn't put it on the air. And then I waited a few minutes, and then they announced there would be a briefing in 5 minutes by Malcolm Kilduff, the assistant press secretary. Salinger, the press secretary, was on his way to Japan to a meeting. And I went down to the room. Malcolm Kilduff was sitting there, tears in his eyes, streaking his cheeks. And he opened his mouth. He tried to speak, and he couldn't speak. The words just didn't come out. He had to force himself, and he said, President John F. Kennedy died today at 1 o'clock Central Standard Time here in Dallas. He died of a gunshot wound to the brain. I have no further information, and all hell broke loose. I ran back. Fortunately, I had this lovely nurse holding my telephone. I had a phone. They were at a premium at that point. And I broadcast the death of the President of the United States. A lot of people say, how did you feel doing it? I didn't know how I felt because I didn't think I was strong enough to do what I did. I admired Kennedy. I covered him from the time he was running for president in the 60 campaign. Made lots of trips with him. I said, I just realized that if I started to think about what I thought of him, I wouldn't get through the day. I wouldn't get through the next 10 minutes. And so I just became a robot. And it could have been John F. Smith, for all I felt at this point. I was just trying not to think of the emotional part of it. You realize that President of the United States is dead. It's a hell of a bullet you're going to do. So I got through the whole day pretty well. And
your day was really just beginning, though.
I had as I was filing some of my reports afterwards from the hospital, a White House official grabbed me and said, you have to come with me. And I was just still broadcasting Kennedy's death. And he said, you have to come with me now. And he had his finger in my collar. And I said, I can't go with you. And he said, you have to come with me. You have no choice. And he got my arm and took me away. And I yelled into the phone, Jim, I'll talk to you later. And he took me downstairs through the emergency room area where they were cleaning up some of the area around where Kennedy was treated. Took me out to a unmarked police car with two other men, my friends, Merriman Smith, chief correspondent for United Press International. He was the dean of correspondence. And Chuck Roberts of Newsweek magazine. They were already there waiting for me. And they needed what they you have a wire service guy, a magazine guy. They needed a broadcast guy, and I was the broadcast guy. That's why they waited. They were waiting for me. Jumped in this police car, and we just took off like a rocket for Love Field. I did some stupid things on that thing. I asked the police officer driving the car, I said, would you call my office, give us a telephone number, you call my office and tell my boss where I am. The guy said, what are you, nuts or something? He said, we're maintaining radio silence. We don't know whether there are other assassins. And besides that, I'm not going to make a phone call for you. In any case. We raced out to Love Field at about 60 or 70 miles an hour, going over curbs, over a couple of front lawns, because we were racing to get to Air Force One before it took off. The casket was already en route to Air Force One. It had not gotten there as yet. Well, what I pieced together after all of that was that President Johnson, in his thinking of what he had to do now, as he prepared to take the oath, was to have a public record of what we were doing. It was to his credit that he thought about this. That's why he wanted the press to be present for that ceremony. It was very important to him. It's just this thinking about how important it was. I'll explain later a little bit. Anyway, we got to the airplane. They were loading the casket on the plane. Mrs. Kennedy had boarded the plane. And they tried to get the casket in through the rear hatch. They walked it up the ladder, and they tried to get it in. There were 3 Secret Service agents on each side. And it couldn't fit because the handles were so big. It was a big 600-pound bronze casket. The Secret Service had picked up the casket at O'Neill's funeral home. It may still be in business. And they went in there and said, we want the best casket you have. That's how they got the bronze casket. Now they've got the problem. So one of the agents went inside the airplane. There's always an axe on an airliner. You know that? In case it crashes, you can't get out if you're still living. You break open the fuselage with an axe. They went in there, got the axe. They knocked off the 2 handles. They got the casket inside. Meanwhile, I was at the back of the airplane watching some of them do this, ran around to the front with Smitty, Merriman Smith, and Chuck Roberts, got on the front stair, got into the airplane. I went back amidships, and there's a conference room on Air Force One. And I went in the conference room, and all the Kennedy staff that traveled with Kennedy, about half of them were there. Most of them were very young, very good-looking, wonderful kids, 23, 24-year-olds, either the staff people from the press office. And they were in there, and they were in terrible shape, the tears flowing and sobs. And I saw LBJ standing next to Judge Hughes, who was wearing this brown dress with these white polka dots. And I nosed myself over there so I could hear what he was saying. And I was standing there when he said to his secretary, Marie, I want you to go back and talk to Mrs. Kennedy in the rear of the aircraft and ask her if she would like to stand with us for the swearing in. And Marie went back to talk to Mrs. Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy sent word back with Marie, yes, I want to attend the ceremony. I need a few minutes to compose myself. She wanted to clean up a little bit. Of course, none of us had seen her since she'd gotten to the airport. And it took about 5 minutes. And then she appeared in the doorway to the conference room, which was about a 10 by 10 room. You can see that picture. LBJ became the master of ceremonies to some extent. He asked his wife to stand in a certain place, and he took Mrs. Kennedy by both hands, and he walked backwards and walked her into the position that would be on his left. And room quieted down a little bit, but when Mrs. Kennedy entered the room, the sobs had increased a lot. I noticed when she came into the room that she had blood on both stockings. The right stocking had more blood on it and more congealed than the left stocking. That's where she cradled his head in the right side of her lap. Her suit was flecked with flesh and blood. She was wide-eyed. She knew where she was. I don't think that she was in shock. I think she was aware of everything, and she was aware of what she did. And in my judgment, it was one of the most courageous things a woman in that situation could do. The fact that she had a split second to decide whether she wanted to sit by the casket or come forward. Her husband's body is in the casket. And I believe Jacqueline Kennedy knew her station. She was the First Lady of the United States. And she felt that she should be in that photograph. Somebody else might have said, I don't want to be. But so it was so important in this particular case because of the political talk about Dallas. She felt if I think, I've not seen this written anywhere, but I think she felt had she not been in that picture, it would have spawned so many wild stories and rumors about she didn't want to go to Texas in the first place. Lyndon Johnson should never have invited my husband. You can just see it. And she would have shunned Lyndon Johnson, too, by not being in that photograph. And she saw the historic importance of that photograph through the centuries. And that's the only evidence there is of the swearing in, except for the oath-taking. So I always gave her a credit. She was 34 years old, mother of two, just had a terrible situation of losing a child, and yet she was able to think about what she had to do as first, what her public responsibility was to be in that photograph. I would guarantee you, I'd bet my house on the fact that the stories would have been so nasty about Texas and LBJ and the Democrats and everything else if she had not been in that photo. The rumor mill would have gone wild, and we have a tendency in the press to go crazy as well. And I could just see the sinister people among us writing all kinds of alternatives to it. So I think that the picture became extraordinarily important. The minute the oath was over, LBJ shouted in a louder voice, "Let's get airborne." And as he was doing that, a lot of the Democratic congressmen who had been in Dallas for this big powwow they were going to have on the weekend those in the cabin started to approach Johnson to shake his hand and congratulate him. I saw Johnson go like this. No. He was not going to allow anything that looked like a celebration to be in the photograph or in that room. He had the good sense to wave it all off. My friend Chuck Roberts, my Newsweek colleague, who knew Johnson from the time he was a congressman, told me, he said, I got to shake his hand. I said, what'd you say, Chuck? He said, well, I looked up at him, and now he's president. This is a guy I've known for 25 years, and I didn't know what to say. And then I said, Godspeed, Mr. President. I thought, gee, I wish I could have said that. It was really fantastic. Johnson then took charge immediately. He ordered the airplane to be taken off the ground. The Secret Service was anxious to get the airplane out of Dallas. There was a conversation between Bobby, the president's brother, and LBJ. There were two phone calls. There were some phone calls that said Bobby said, wait, come back to Washington for the oath. That's not true. LBJ didn't have much of it. He did what he thought was right. Take the oath as soon as you can. It was the wisest thing they could have done is take the oath in Dallas instead of waiting 2.5 hours. Yet you're in the air for at least 3 hours coming to Washington. And by the time you got to Washington, the bureaucracy would have gone crazy and said, well, we have to have a big ceremony, so we'll wait till next week to do it. And then you got to invite kings and queens and princesses from all over the world. This is the easiest, best, fastest way to do it. That was LBJ's decision. He convinced Bobby that was the right decision. And it was the right decision. They came to me and said there are only 2 seats left on Air Force One to go back to Washington. Merriman Smith gets one of them because your wire service gets one because they report for everybody. You and Chuck have to flip a coin. I said, Chuck, I'm getting off. You can have the seat. He thanked me forever. For the rest of his life, he thanked me because he writes for Newsweek magazine. They write largely features. They don't do breaking news. They write what was it like he needed that time, and being on the airplane coming back, he would know what Mrs. Kennedy had done during this 3-hour flight, what President Johnson did during the 3-hour flight. I just wanted to get on the air and talk about the swearing in. So it suited me to get off. It suited Chuck to stay on. And I left the airplane with Judge Hughes, very nice lady, 67 years old at the time. And I had a long conversation with her. I couldn't get off the field to give the pool report because the field was secure. So I said, would you go over and talk to the sergeant over there and tell that cop to let me go off the field? I got to report to the rest of the press about the swearing in. And she said, sure, I'll go over and talk to him. And the cop overheard me. He said, lady, you're not going anywhere. You're both staying here. So I didn't get off the field. But then the press bus came back to the airport with all the reporters, all my buddies and friends, and I gave the pool report at the airport. I was the last one to file because everybody else got to the phones before I did. Naturally, the New York Times reporter had more questions about what happened on the airplane than anybody else, so I had to wait till the last reporter asked his last question before I was allowed to file. That's the rule. You can't file the story for yourself if you're a pool reporter. You have to give it to everybody. So Tom Wicker of the New York Times kept me there for another 10 minutes, so I had to wait until everybody else did. But I had an exclusive story. I had an inside story on the thing.
You watched Air Force One take off. Tell me the thought that was in your mind when you saw that plane disappear.
I was standing with Judge Hughes, and I watched Colonel Jim Swindle was the pilot, Alabama, and I saw him take Air Force One as far as he could go to the far end of the runway because they loaded Air Force One with as much fuel as a Boeing 707 ever carried anywhere because they didn't know where they were going to go. If Washington was under fire or under siege, if this was a larger than assassination problem, they weren't going to go back to Washington. They would be directed to go somewhere safe. So the airplane was fully loaded with fuel. And I watched it just it used every inch of runway. I just watched lumbering down that runway, and I was praying to see it get off the ground. It moved up, and I saw it disappear into the eastern sky heading back to I watched it, stood there and just watched it turn into a little speck. Here you had the new commander-in-chief, and the fallen warrior, John F. Kennedy, in a casket in the back of the airplane. How unbelievable the situation that was to be covering that. Never did I think I'd ever cover anything like that. Judge Hughes was standing next to me, and she's in tears. And she told me, she said, Lyndon Johnson appointed me, and John Kennedy sent it up for confirmation on the Hill. Actually, Lyndon nominated him. Lyndon nominated her for the judgeship, and then Kennedy was the one who chose her. So she had a personal relationship with the two men, the fact that they made her a federal judge. The one thing about it, though, humor, I would not have worn that dress that day that she wore. Great big yellow, white polka dots on the front. It didn't fit, but she had no choice in the matter.
If you have questions for Sid Davis, if you'll fill out your cards and pass them to the end of your rows, we'll take as many of those as we can. While we're waiting for those cards, Sid, I know, of course, we have the funeral over the next several days. It's a terrible weekend for all who remember it. And then we have, as our last slide here, we have Lyndon Johnson, a famous photograph there on the right, a picture of you and President Johnson on the left.
Yeah.
You spent quite a lot of time with Johnson, and there's a great story about how you hitched a ride with him once in the rain. Tell us about that.
He was now president for 1965, so it was a year and a half or so. Johnson was acted like no other president, and so did Lady Bird, in the sense that they invited everybody to the White House. Johnson wasn't big for the ceremonial things. He was a down-to-earth, poor kid from the hill country of Texas. He became president, and he behaved like one. And he was criticized a lot for being so homespun. I never saw a problem in it. But he's now president for a year and a half, I guess, and he was dedicating something to the Smithsonian Institution. It was April 1965. It was a rainy night in Washington, and I covered it. About 7 p.m., I started back to the White House with 3 other reporters, Charlie Moore of the New York Times, Muriel Bobbin of Baltimore Sun, and a guy that I'd never seen before. It was his first day ever covering the White House for Mutual Broadcasting. We're walking in the rain toward the White House. It was only about 3 or 4 blocks, and the presidential limousine pulled up alongside of us. The window rolled down, and Johnson sticks his head out the window. He said, "You're walking or riding?" We said, "We're walking, Mr. President." He said, "Well, how'd you like a ride?" We said, "Sure." So we jumped in the car. Jack Valenti, his aide, also from Texas, took another seat up front, and we sat with the president. He said to Valenti, "When's my next appointment, Jack?" And he said, "Your next appointment has been waiting since 7 o'clock this morning." Johnson kept everybody waiting. He met all day until midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning most days. So we went to the White House with him. He said, I got time to buy these folks a scotch and soda. So we went to the White House. He ordered drinks for us. We were in the family quarters. And immediately he started peddling his programs: War on Poverty, Great Society, Civil Rights, Medicare. He's always pitching. He never wasted a minute. That scotch and soda was a lure to get us into the White House. And we had a few sips of the drink, and he said, "I'm going to deliver a speech at Johns Hopkins University tomorrow night. I'm going to end this goddamn war. And I'll let you hear parts of it." So he took us down to the Oval Office. He had Valenti go get the rough draft of the speech he would deliver the next night. He read us parts of the speech. There were 2 major points. One was going to be offering Ho Chi Minh a bombing halt of North Vietnam and $1 billion development program. He would give North Vietnam and South Vietnam $1 billion to do with it what they want. He would hope they build bridges, build hospitals, educate children, a whole list of things. He said they can use this money. I'll give them these things, a bombing halt and the money, if only he will come and talk to me face to face. Just one-on-one, we sit down and we try to end this damn thing. He was so hopeful this speech would do it. It was a beautifully done speech. And then he asked us to come with him, and we followed him up to the Lincoln bedroom. He said, "Sit on the bed." I said, "No, we don't want to sit on the bed." I said, "Sit on the bed." So Muriel said, "Okay, we'll sit on the bed." So we sat on the bed. And then he got very serious, and he said, "I come up here many nights a week. And I pick up that phone over there, and I call the Situation Room. And I ask, how many of my boys didn't come back today?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I said, whispered to Muriel, "Did you hear what I heard?" She said, "I heard it." He said, "I want to end this war. I don't know what it'll take, but whatever he wants, I'll try to give him if he'll just come and talk to me." And he talked for a little bit more about the war and what he was trying to do. And then he walked over to the portrait of Lincoln in the bedroom on the wall. He said, "I sure hope I got better generals than he had. Doing what's right is easy," he said. "Knowing what's right is the hard part." By that time, it was getting close to 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night. We'd been with him an hour or two. And I got a little nervous. And at the late hour, and then Valenti came in and said, "You have to leave right now. It's too late." So we all said goodnight to LBJ. If Mrs. Johnson was in New York, he didn't like to be alone. So we were his guests for the night. So we left the White House, walked back out there. We said goodnight, Mr. President. We walked back into the rain. We headed toward Pennsylvania Avenue, which would have been, Pennsylvania Avenue at that point was freedom. I got outside those gates. I said to Muriel as we headed for the gates, "Muriel, have we got a story tonight?" I just couldn't believe that we had this inside, just the Johnson's feelings. It's the first time he bared his soul to anybody in public. And just as we're leaving the White House grounds, there's a patter of little feet behind us. It's Valenti, the president's aide. He stopped us. He said, "Wait a minute. Everything you saw and heard tonight is was off the record. So I never printed a word of the story. I did in speeches like this, but I never wrote a word of the story. And the bottom line is, he went back to work. This picture of Johnson leaning into this guy. The guy he's leaning into is his lawyer, Abe Fortas, who became a Supreme Court justice for a short period of time. But Johnson could lean over. He had a way of standing on his feet, not falling down, and bending over to where the point the guy he was talking to was way back. He did this with a 90-year-old senator, Theodore Green of Vermont. Green almost fell over. He was trying to get a piece of legislation passed, and that's how he did it. Johnson would jaw until he got what he wanted. He's the greatest. He was the greatest parliamentarian ever to serve in the White House. Probably more legislation than any other president. Medicare, 64. Voting, public accommodation, 64. Voting rights, 65. Medicare, you name it, and he's done it. In the arts and humanities, education, Job Corps, all of these things he was able to push through because he told the staff, even on his way back from Dallas, I've got a short time. There's going to be a lot of goodwill toward me. I can get some things done if we do it early. I'm telling you, he told us to members of the cabinet, send me everything you ever thought the United States government ought to do for people as fast as you can, because we had a very short window here to get some of it done. And he got a lot of it done.
We have about 15 minutes left, so we're going to try to go through some of these quickly. First, we'll knock out a good chunk of these with me asking this question. Do you think Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, or do you think there was a conspiracy?
I think Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, period.
Why?
Because I believe he shot and killed the president. He had a mail-order gun. His fingerprints were on the gun. There's been no evidence corroborating anybody that might have been in touch with him. He was a loner. He didn't have many friends. I've talked to the guy who used to drive him to work, Buell, whatever his name is. I've been on speaking programs with the guy who used to take Lee Harvey Oswald to work every day. When he told me he was a loner, he had very few friends. He had a very unhappy married life. Who knows what it was? He went to the Soviet Union. He got into trouble in some of the things he did there. His fingerprints are on the weapon. The receipt where he bought the mail-order gun, I think it was 1995 or something, out of the mail-order house in Chicago. All the evidence points to that. That's the strongest point. The other points, the other so-called conspiracy theories, can be shot full of holes. And I do believe the Warren Commission report. I think they did a reasonably good job. They made some mistakes. But I think the fact is that no one has disputed the evidence they have. And my Secret Service friend, Clint Hill, believes it was only one shooter. I don't think the conspiracy theories hold up because there's not enough evidence to support it. A lot of them have been shot down. A lot of them are by sensational guys that want to make a buck on assassination. You can make a lot of money with a conspiracy book if you've made it strange enough. You can do it. I just don't believe it. I don't know who wrote that. I don't mean to put down the person who wrote it.
There were quite a few, actually. Quite a few people wanted to know the answer to that question.
Well, I'm sure that you think I'm crazy for the way I feel, but I don't think I am. I just don't. 54 years?
Yeah.
I just don't believe there's anybody in the woodwork. It would have come out some way by now, had there been. I just don't see that's possible.
All right. There was also a couple of different questions, different phrasings of this same basic question. There is so much antagonism today between the press and the presidency. How do you feel about this evolution over the years, considering the way you discussed your relationship?
Well, we
with
didn't
Kennedy
get along.
Johnson?
We didn't trust everything the government told us, but it's our government. You can be destructive about it and say the whole thing stinks or the whole thing's a swamp. Washington is not a swamp. It's a pretty good place to live. I think there are many churches in Washington as there are in Dallas. We live the way you people do. It's a little different. The nature of the work of the city is different. I just resent the fact that in this period here where the press is being dumped on constantly by the President of the United States, Nixon did it. I'm not saying that Trump faces the same outcome, but Nixon's animosity toward the press was enormous, mainly because his own shortcomings, his own faults. He created a situation where he was going to subvert the United States Constitution. You can't do that. You can't have dirty tricks departments. You can't lie. You can't want to burn down the Brookings Institution because they don't agree with everything you say. I think just because people don't agree with you, it's fake news. The fake news isn't coming from your newspapers. I'm sure they make mistakes. Some stories are overdone. There's a lot of extravagant language in the things now, almost to the point today. There's vulgarity in the papers today. I saw in the Washington Post yesterday use the word "pissed off." In my day, you wouldn't have a job tomorrow if you wrote a story like that. Standards are different. I think the major newspapers in this country, the Dallas Morning News, I think they're responsible newspapers. They don't go to press every day saying they're going to print fake news. If you want fake news, go to the internet. Go to the bloggers. Who's checking their copy? We have a president that's on the air now. He's tweeting. If I were married to a beautiful woman, I wouldn't be tweeting at 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm going to tell you that. So, sorry to bring a subject up here, but this stands to reason. If you're going to tweet, get some fact checkers. Well, the New York Times did a piece recently where they counted 1,000 confirmed lies in statements that the president makes. How long can you do that and get away with it? Just because you declare it the truth doesn't mean it is the truth unless you can prove it. And there are places to go. If you're going to tweet, get a fact checker that's going to be there, and it spare you a lot of heartache with the corrections. So now we're going through a period now where there's a deliberate campaign against the press. And yet, if you, my understanding, talking to people who cover the White House today, a lot of the White House reporters like President Trump a lot because he's accessible. Now, President Obama was not really accessible. He's very shy. He was a noodler. If you had a serious problem, it took President Obama a long time before he made a decision. He would examine every aspect of every problem. When Stanley McChrystal wanted more troops for Afghanistan, he waited 6 months for an answer from President Trump because he wanted to make sure sending 6,000 or 50,000 more troops to Afghanistan was a good move. So what McChrystal did is he leaked it to the Washington Post that he wanted these troops. It was a secret request for troops. And so people in government like McChrystal got very impatient with Obama because he's more of an intellectual, but he would study things until he was positive what he was doing was right. And then you have Donald Trump, who's a little more impetuous, a guy who wants more answers, more action before other presidents did. It takes all kinds. When you start to attack the press, I'm reminded pretty much of President Nixon and his attitude toward the press. He didn't like him. He was never popular in California with the press. He resented that. He was always behind the 8 ball in terms of his economic standings. He was not rich. And I think that had a lot to do with his attitude toward Kennedy and toward a lot of other people. Look, we have something here. I brought this. Let me just read it to you. "40 men meeting in 1787 came up with the most beautiful document ever written throughout history. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or of abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." The very First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution says hands off the press. The oath the president took says, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And the very first amendment in the Constitution is the Bill of Rights and freedom of the press and the right to assemble. So he accepted this challenge. It's on paper. He said he's going to uphold the Constitution of the United States, and now he wants to change it because he wants to be able to sue the press for libel. Now, those of you who are lawyers in the room or have some sense of legal stuff, if you are a public official, it is very tough to win a libel suit because you have the extra burden, if you're a public official, of proving malice. You've got to prove that you were damaged. And throughout history, public officials have a tough time winning libel suits. So our president wants to change the Constitution. I think you'll have a tough time changing the First Amendment. I think Republicans and Democrats alike would not buy that.
I want to ask one more question because I think it's a fitting question to end our evening tonight. This is a question about your coverage later the night of the assassination when you were at the White House and the Navy ambulance arrived and you signed off with a quote from Robert Frost.
Woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep.
The question was, what made you decide to use that when
I don't
Kennedy's
know.
body
I really
came out?
don't know. I knew that I'd have a tough, well, you see how emotional I was at a couple of things tonight. I knew it was going to be tough for me to say it. I had been up for 2 straight days at that point in San Antonio and then into Houston and then to Fort Worth and Dallas. And I covered the assassination. I gave the pool report, and then I had to wait for the press plane to take us back to Washington somewhere around 11 p.m. That's November 22nd, 63. And when I arrived at the White House, by the way, when I arrived at the White House, Merriman Smith, the dean of the correspondence and the White House correspondent for United Press International, was waiting for me. And he put a hammer lock on me. And he said, "You son of a bitch. I told you the time was 2:39 Central Standard Time, and you wrote that the oath was given at 2:38 Central Standard Time." Now, what happened was, when I gave the pool report, I gave what was in my notepad. You saw my notepad, 2:38 p.m. And when I gave the pool report, when I left the airplane, Smitty, I should have mentioned this earlier, Smitty yelled down the ramp as I was leaving with Judge Hughes, "The time was 2:39. You got it, kid?" He called me kid. And he was the dean of correspondence, so he felt that whatever he said went. And when I gave the pool report, I gave my time instead of his time. And when he got back to Washington, the story he wrote for United Press International, my time was inserted into his story. So he was furious with me because that 1 minute, we were good friends, and we ended up being very good friends. He forgave me, the prodigal son. He forgave me after a period of time. But why did I use the Robert Frost thing? Because Kennedy used it on the campaign trail. We would be campaigning. He would never campaign with a jacket. He wore just a shirt or suit jacket. And it would be colder than hell. When you got to the eastern part of the United States in the Appalachians, you went to eastern Pennsylvania or the anthracite region, talking to coal miners, talking to their families. At the end of every speech, he would close with Robert Frost, "The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep." And he said, "I have my promises to keep, next stop, such and such." And when I was doing the broadcast at the White House, I was broadcasting with a Westinghouse Broadcasting colleague, Ann Corrick, and we both did the show. The body arrived at 4 a.m. the next day, the next morning. I had not been to bed for 2 days because I didn't sleep in Fort Worth that night before. I was tired, but I wanted some way to close the broadcast with something better than I could say myself. Nothing I wrote compares with Robert Frost. And I wanted a closure that would do it. There were 400 people outside the White House gates. It was a chilly November, very crisp air. The leaves were already off the trees. It was rather bleak. I'd watched the ambulance come up the driveway with Mrs. Kennedy seated in the back with her hand on the casket. Incidentally, some of you may say, why was it an ambulance carrying the president's body? It was because Mrs. Kennedy did not want John Kennedy to be carried in a hearse. So at Bethesda Naval Hospital, when the need for the ambulance came after the post-mortem, Secret Service went downstairs with Mrs. Kennedy's instruction that she wanted an ambulance. And the agent said to the young Lieutenant J.G. at the desk, by the way, sir, we'd like to have an ambulance instead of a hearse. And the young fellow looked through the book. I'm sorry, naval regulations say they were not permitted to carry a corpse in an ambulance. And the agent said, son, if I were you, I'd get an ambulance. And that's the way it was. One other, I mentioned Clint Hill, Mrs. Kennedy's agent. He saved her life and tried to save John Kennedy's life. I really can't conclude a program like this without mentioning the Secret Service and the people who work in the government. They take a bum rap most of the time, as Dallas did during the assassination, I think. Clint Hill was the father of 2 children, 2 sons. When he covered the White House as a special agent in charge of the presidential detail, particularly Mrs. Kennedy, he earned $4,000 a year. And for that, he was expected to throw his body in front of the president and take the bullets, among the other difficult things he had to do as an agent. It's a tough life, a tough job. And so I always think of people like Clint Hill. His is a more remarkable story because Clint Hill, for many years after the assassination, did not work very much. He turned to alcohol for a while. He believed that if he had gotten to the right side of the presidential limousine chasing after him, started the Zapruder film, he jumps off the Queen Mary, the follow-up car, and tries to get to the presidential limousine. Mrs. Kennedy was already on the trunk of the car. Clint tried to get around to the right side so he could get if there were more shots, that he would take the shots. But he realized the car was moving too fast and going the straight line, that Mrs. Kennedy was faster, and he wouldn't have made it to the other side. He stumbled almost into the street. If he had fallen into the street, that follow-up car is a 1955 Cadillac convertible. It weighs 8 tons. It would run over him. If it had run over him, he'd have been killed. And if the car continued to go with Mrs. Kennedy on the trunk, she would have fallen off the trunk because it was increased. The driver didn't even know she was on the trunk. She'd have fallen off and been killed probably too. So Clint Hill's okay now.
He's actually been here before.
He's become an author of several books.
Yeah, he's been here several times.
Yes, I know. That's right. So if you've been here, you know Clint Hill. But my hat's off to the people I work with, the Secret Service and people like that. Well, the only other comment I have is coming back to Washington. We went to before the press plane took off, we gathered at the Dallas Press Club, which serves great liquor. And White House correspondents have a reputation for the grape, as we say. And we went in there to wait for the press plane to take off from Love Field, and naturally the request for whiskey was made. Bob Donovan of the New York Herald Tribune asked a tall black waiter if he can get us a bottle, because we're very tired. It's been a tough day and we have much to do from now on. And the waiter said, "I'm sorry, the bar's closed, no liquor's being served." And Bob Donovan said, "Look, we really need a drink." And the waiter repeated what he said. And at one point, Bob said, well, can't you break the law and get us a bottle? This guy had a voice like a Wurlitzer organ. He said, I think enough laws have been broken in Dallas today.
That's a good note to end on. Sid Davis, thank you so much for being here and telling your story.